Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. This week, President Trump declares a national emergency. What happens next? And how states and cities are pushing back on the Trump administration's border security measures. All that just ahead. Before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today, we've got a full house. Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
Where can folks find you on Twitter?
At BPC_T Brown. Follow me there.
Katie Sullivan, Immigration Project Associate. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Jordan.
Are you on Twitter?
No.
Okay. Making his podcast debut, David Lapan, Vice President of Communications and a former DHS and Joint Chiefs spokesperson. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Jordan. And I'll beat you to the question and say I'm on Twitter at Dave Lapan DC.
Great. And Cris Ramón, Immigration Policy Analyst.
Hey, Jordan.
Hi, Cris.
You can find me at Ramón BPC.
All right. So we're starting off today with several major developments in the ongoing debate over President Trump's border wall. A little less than 2 weeks ago, Congress approved a spending bill to avoid another shutdown. That bill, which came after 3 weeks of congressional negotiation, provided more than $49 billion in funding for DHS, including $1.375 billion for steel bollard fencing. The bill also slashed the number of ICE detention beds for non-citizens in removal proceedings from about 49,000 to just more than 40,000. So, Katie, I want to bring you in here quickly to give a little context around those numbers. You wrote recently about the infrastructure and technology currently in use at the border. What kind of physical barriers are already in place?
Well, the U.S.-Mexico border is a little under 2,000 miles long, and currently 654 miles of that have some type of barrier. So that's about a third of the border. And those barriers can be divided into two categories, pedestrian and vehicle. And there are styles that vary within those categories, but most of the barriers along the southwest border are pedestrian. But there are some places that have only that vehicle barrier, which is not sufficient to prevent people crossing on foot. And Tucson and El Paso are areas that have primarily that vehicle fencing right now. But all of that 654 miles was constructed prior to the Trump administration. Most of it happened after the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which was passed under President George W. Bush. What we've seen so far under the Trump administration has been repairing and replacing existing structures. But now we'll start to see some construction of new border wall, especially in Texas. And that $1.375 billion construction of physical barrier that you mentioned specifies 55 miles in the Rio Grande Valley.
And what about technology? Border infrastructure and security goes beyond a wall. So how much does this agreement invest in those technologies?
Well, when we talk about technology at the border, we're talking about a wide range of things. There are stadium lights, there are a variety of types of sensors, thermal imaging devices, remote video surveillance systems. There's some surveillance systems that are truck mounted, short, medium, and long range. There are towers. Radar systems, but CBP also has a wide range of aircrafts, some manned, some unmanned, marine vehicles. There are about 240 aircrafts and 300 marine vehicles currently. And $113 million is what's been provided in the bill for increased air and marine assets and $100 million for new border security technology. So we are seeing an investment there.
Great, thanks. And if you want to dig into those numbers a little bit further, you can find all that information on our blog, bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Thanks, Katie. So President Trump signed that funding bill, but he also declared a national emergency, which the White House says will unlock other sources of government funding to build the wall. Congressional Democrats quickly criticized the move, questioning the president's authority to repurpose those funds and arguing that the conditions on the ground didn't warrant the declaration. Some congressional Republicans, too, expressed concern that using the declaration power this way could pave the way for future Democratic presidents to declare emergencies to fulfill their own domestic policy goals. Theresa, what did this emergency declaration say?
Well, the emergency declaration essentially said that the president was invoking his powers under the National Emergencies Act and therefore opening up the ability to allocate resources, particularly from the Department of Defense, toward supporting border enforcement. Specifically, there are provisions in various Department of Defense legislation that allow the president to allocate monies to support military activities. Since he has previously called out active duty military and National Guard to the border, the argument is that the building of this infrastructure through Department of Defense funds is in support of that military action, which is all in support of this national emergency that is happening at the border.
Dave, I'll bring you in here. So how are those military resources Theresa mentioned going to be used to build the wall?
So there are a couple of key points to start with, and that's that the administration has identified about $8.1 billion in additional funding that they intend to tap. Two of those funding sources go to Department of Defense funds. Interestingly, and a key point too, is that one of those pots of money, which focuses on counter-drug operations, isn't directly related to the national emergency. So this could have been done even without that declaration. The other funding source specifically relates to moving funding from Department of Defense military construction funds in the event of the declaration of war or a national emergency. So in those two different sources, the administration announced that up to $2.5 billion would come from those counter-drug funds, and up to $3.6 billion would be reallocated from the military construction funds under the declaration of a national emergency.
So what are the impacts of repurposing those funds? What doesn't get funded as a result of this?
Well, looking at those two different sources of funding, so one thing to note is in the fiscal 19 DoD appropriation that was already passed by the Congress, that only includes about $517 million for counter-narcotic support. So even though the administration noted that up to $2.5 billion would come from that source, there's actually only about $500 million in that account. And if you look at funds from that counter-narcotics fund that have not already been appropriated, it gets you down to about $100 million. There has been some discussion now that the administration may use that particular fund and use another authority that the Secretary of Defense already has, again, separate from a national emergency, to move funds from within Department of Defense accounts. So the idea is that they would take military funds from other sources, move them into this counter-narcotics fund, and then tap into that as a source for this border security effort. That second tranche of money, the up to $3.6 billion that the administration notes would come under military construction projects, are something, again, directly related to the national emergency declaration, and ones where the military would have to then decide, and let me put a fine point on it, not the military, the Secretary of Defense. The way that the statute is written, it directs the Secretary of Defense to be able to undertake military construction and use the funds. And here is a key point that as this declaration is being litigated in the courts, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, is that those military construction funds are to be in support of the use of the armed forces. So the Department of Defense, in concert with DHS in the administration, is going to have to justify which military construction funds are going to be used in such a way that they are in support of the armed forces, not just a general need for border security by way of a wall or fence. In both cases, in both of those instances of funding sources, it's going to force the Department of Defense to make tough choices about where to take funds. So some of those projects, both in the military construction budget and in the counter-drug budget, means that any funds that are diverted over to this border wall purpose are being taken from elsewhere. And it could involve military housing, it could involve schools, it could involve barracks and hangars. There are many things. So the key to watch will be which projects the Department of Defense has already identified as needing funds will lose those funds in order to be shifted over to this effort.
If I could just come in, the counter-drug mission of the Department of Defense is important because a lot of that takes place outside the United States. So you have like the Joint Interagency Task Forces in the South and the West, which is DOD and DHS and other law enforcement agencies working together to counter basically the cartel's transportation and delivery networks. And that uses everything from air and maritime assets of the DOD and these civilian agencies to law enforcement and intelligence operations that are joined. So if you're taking money from those counter drug operations, you're taking money that's going right against the cartel organizations and putting it at the border, which is, where we're trying to interdict the drugs themselves. But the premise of DOD counter drug operations has always been about interdicting and disrupting those drug transportation networks long before they get to the border.
And if I could add 2 points to that, a great point by Theresa. One, again, at that larger counter-drug mission that DOD has, I note that the commander of U.S. Southern Command testified recently about their counter-narcotic mission and the need for more aircraft and ships, specifically, not talking about border fencing or wall. The second piece is that particular part of the law under Title 10, the subsection 284 that I was talking about is the funding source. One provision is that it talks specifically about construction of roads and fences and installation of lighting to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries. So again, it is more specific in the way that the statute is written. So it'll be interesting to see how that's applied.
So I ask this then to piggyback off of what you've just said, Dave, knowing that there's no clear answer, but does the president have the legal authority to take these actions?
The White House believes he does, but as the president said when he announced it, he expects to be sued, and indeed he has been sued. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but he has already been sued by several states and a city and the ACLU over this, and so every detail of this will probably be litigated. The one thing that's very interesting that a lot of people, at least in the press and the public discourse, is whether or not this is really a national emergency. If it's a national emergency, why has it taken so long? Why did you let the process play out for months and months over the appropriations bill and not do it sooner? I think legally, that's probably the issue that's least likely to be relevant because the statute really does give the president wide discretion on what is considered a national emergency. I think these other issues, the technicalities of the allocation of the funds and the authorization of moving money under the law, I think those will be the kinds of things that will probably turn a lot of this litigation, such as how is it in defense of the armed forces? How are those armed forces deployed? There is a question about the counter-drug activity. Certainly, we've said this before, and it's pretty well known that the majority of drugs coming across the U.S.-Mexico border are not coming between the ports of entry. They're coming at the ports of entry. That doesn't mean zero between, but it does mean a lot more at the ports of entry than between. So is that really an appropriate use of this funding in a counter-drug mission? I think those are the kinds of questions that will probably be part and parcel of a lot of this litigation, and that will turn an awful lot of this. You also have the threats by Congress. Speaker Pelosi has said that they have the ability in Congress to pass a resolution disapproving the national emergency declaration. That legislation has already begun to move in the House. If it moves in the House under the terms of the National Emergencies Act, the Senate has to take it up, and it's a simple majority vote. Now have to be 4 Republicans that join with the Democrats to pass that in the Senate. The president could certainly veto it. We don't know if it's a veto-proof majority, but the speaker has also said that they also are looking at whether or not Congress has the right to litigate this to enforce their ability under the Constitution to control appropriations.
So you mentioned Speaker Pelosi. What has the broader congressional reaction to this declaration been?
I think most Democrats have pretty universally panned it. Several Republicans have expressed concern, at least before the president enacted it or issued the national emergency declaration. A lot of the issues that Republicans have with it are, one of executive overreach, that they would say that no administration, Democrat or Republican, should necessarily do this. I think there's a fear among some Republicans that sort of what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and if President Trump can use an emergency declaration in this way, what would a future Democratic president use it for? And maybe those are things that maybe Republicans would not support. But whether or not that constitutes enough that they would actually vote against the president on the national emergency declaration, I think we'll have to see.
Cris, you wanted to jump in here?
Yeah, Senate Republicans, retweeting a tweet from Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat, on what constitutes national emergencies to her, including gun violence, climate change, and sort of saying if President Trump can, declare a national emergency on what's happening in the border, what would prevent a President Warren from coming in saying that and sort of really putting that as a highlight of this is what we're walking into. So they've been pretty clear about what that constitutes for the future, at least under future Democratic administrations.
Yeah, Dave, your thoughts?
And just one other key element to this that we are seeing from both sides of the aisle, and that's some concern in Congress about Congress's Title I authorities. Congress, by the U.S. Constitution, appropriates funding. In this case, the president is, as many have said, done an end run around Congress using this emergency declaration to fund things that Congress refused to fund, not only most recently, but even over the last 2 years. So a number of members of Congress are concerned, both congressional and constitutional scholars, also concerned with this idea that the separation of powers under the Constitution and the Congress's Article I authorities, specifically revolving around funding and budgets, are being usurped here. And that is a dangerous precedent that folks on both sides of the aisle have identified.
I just want to reiterate something Dave said, because it's important to understand that it's not just this current Congress that didn't give the president funding. He had Republican control of Congress for the last 2 years, and in neither of the two previous appropriations bills did they give him anywhere near the amount of money that he thought he wanted for the wall, and he signed those bills also. So this is really about Congress versus the executive.
So I want to step back from that fight to ask about the reaction in the broader advocate community. Theresa, Cris, I know you guys have been tracking that.
Well, I think, for a lot of the immigration advocates that have been opposing the wall per se and any funding for the wall, they don't like that the administration has done this. As I mentioned, one of the litigants against the president is the ACLU, which I think is now probably in its 15th case against this president on immigration-related or border-related matters. So recent polling on the national emergency has shown that a majority of Americans do not support the declaration of a national emergency, but that is very divided by party. So you have in several of the polls, at least 80% of Republicans are supportive of the national emergency declaration, and the reverse is true on the Democratic side. At least 80% oppose it. When you ask about the wall itself, though, the population's a little more split. So overall polling on that is maybe 45 to 47% in favor of a wall and about an equal amount opposing. Again, there's definitely a party split there. But again, when you poll overall Americans, particularly with the strong opposition by Democrats and some independents, about 6 in 10 are opposing the national emergency declaration. The party difference, though, means that Trump is absolutely on par with where his base is at.
Yeah, and if anything that can be really taken out of that, I think that it shows that voters want at least maybe a consensus-driven approach to addressing this issue. I think that maybe the way that they're hesitant about it is the way it's going about. I really wish, actually, that there had been polling on the thought about the negotiations that happened over 3 weeks, how people viewed that, because I think this is really one of the first attempts to have good faith negotiations over immigration budgeting, but also some additional policies that are in the deal. Jordan, you and I talked about that a little bit in the recent episode of Pints and Policy. But it would have been nice to get that sense too, because I think right now what we know is that people oppose this particular option that the president has chosen. It would have been nice to have seen what do they think about the negotiations as well.
So I'll close this section by asking what I feel like I ask all the time, which is, what now? What happens next?
Litigation, and more litigation. So at least one of the lawsuits has asked for a temporary restraining order against the national emergency declaration. So if the judge in that case issues a temporary restraining order, everything will go on hold while the case winds its way through the courts. There are at least 3 different jurisdictions looking at it. There's been lawsuits in the D.C. federal court, in the Ninth Circuit in California, and again now in the Fifth Circuit down in southern Texas. So at least 3 different jurisdictions are looking at this, and it will be a series of long litigations.
All right, on the other side of a quick break, states are pushing back on the Trump administration's border security efforts. We'll explore how and why. Stick around. And we're back. As President Trump's efforts to build his border wall roil the national immigration debate, states and cities have started pushing back, seeking to limit the administration's border security measures. At the state level, Governor Gavin Newsom in California and Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham in New Mexico announced that they would withdraw their National Guard units from the U.S.-Mexico border. Meanwhile, San Diego and several cities in Arizona have challenged some border security and asylum policies as well. Cris, how else are states and cities challenging the administration's plans on border security and asylum?
So I'll take a look at what's happening with the cities and the counties. I think if you had to take a broad takeaway is that cities and counties have been fighting the Trump administration on their border security policy because they feel that this policies have either presented threats to their communities, have maybe countered economic growth, or present a future challenge to economic growth. So in terms of cities, Nogales, Arizona, has made a little bit of press with the fact that their city council issued a resolution against the barbed wire that had been set up by U.S. military along the wall that goes through the city. And what they've been basically saying is that this presents a safety threat because this wire actually goes all the way from the top of the fence to the bottom. And so for them, under the city codes, they can actually only have the wire up, towards the top of the fence. So it's very technical, but for them, they're saying, this is going through our downtown. It's covered in wire. It could be a public threat. And they also kind of see it as, an invasion. And, I was reading sort of responses in local papers, and they said, we feel like we're under invasion, but not by immigrants, but by our own government. And that's a pretty stringent statement to make. And so they issued the resolution. They may actually go ahead and, issue a lawsuit against the Trump administration for this action. Now, in San Diego, this is interesting, where you saw San Diego County actually sue the Trump administration because of its asylum policy. Prior to about September of last year, there was some coordination between federal authorities and local stakeholders and government agencies for basically ensuring that asylum seekers who entered into San Diego could be, coordinated with families and other services to ensure that they were able to integrate. But then when that program ended, Immigration and Customs Enforcement would just simply let these individuals out. And so the county actually sued the administration, saying that this is basically putting a strain on our resources, making it very difficult for us to support this population. It is interesting because San Diego sued against California SB 54, which is a sanctuary city bill that the state passed, saying that it was basically promoting legal immigration. But they say that they're taking this new lawsuit, because they believe the asylum is a legal form of immigration, and they want to promote it as well as possible. And what's late breaking, I think, within 2 hours of this being recorded, is the county of El Paso has sued the administration for the National Emergency Declaration. Specifically, it is a long lawsuit, but the core argument is that they're saying that the emergency declaration and building the wall will actually affect future economic growth, will require them to allocate resources that they would have basically put towards economic growth, towards dealing with the construction of the wall. So that is the injury that they claim they would receive if things went through with the building of the wall. So it's really interesting to see, this happening, because we were just talking about lawsuits. It's interesting to see a county just say, this is going to harm us. So that's kind of looking at it with the cities and the counties.
So, Cris, in a broader sense, what do these actions tell us about the role states and cities play in advancing any administration's border security and asylum policies?
This is really important because I think up until this point, we've been seeing cities, counties, and states basically commenting on interior enforcement. The whole debate really has been around quote-unquote sanctuary jurisdictions, which, we've talked about this on this podcast, that there is no legal definition, but there's a whole host of policies that promote or actually limit federal and local cooperation on immigration enforcement. That's really been the debate. But now I think we're starting to see a new front open up, where we're now starting to see cities and counties commenting on what's going to be happening with the border and border policies or asylum policies. And this is actually very different, because I think up until this point, they've been fairly dormant, haven't been saying that much. But now this is, I think, a very new and very interesting area that now, as the debate has gone maybe from interior enforcement to the border, states and counties and cities are going to weigh in. I think it's also worth mentioning, as you said in the intro, of the decisions from the governors of New Mexico and California to pull back National Guard's troops, that once again, they're going to keep playing a major role in this. I think states have and always will be playing a role, as they have over the last, 10 years or so, on immigration policy and debates. But now I think we're starting to see them weigh in a lot more on border policy. So expect this to be a whole new front, struggles, to be honest, between the Trump administration and certain states, counties, and cities.
Yeah, one thing I think that makes this different is you have to understand that for federal border officials, they live and work in these communities, and they try very hard to have good relations with the city officials, with the other local law enforcement partners, with the business community, because they have to interact with them on a regular basis. But there's no formal requirement or involvement of cities and localities along the border of that coordination. It's sort of been this good government. Federal wants to be a good partner with the localities. This is sort of putting a wedge there. And again, for a lot of reasons, most localities and counties along the border have tried to be good partners with the federal law enforcement that exists on a daily basis in their communities. But this is putting strains, and the strains are starting to show, and now it's starting to result in litigation. And so operationally moving forward for the federal agencies in those regions, rebuilding that relationship and trust is going to be a challenge, because the national policies are coming in and sort of overriding those local relationships.
Yeah, with the Nogales case, for instance, one of the things that threw off the city officials that they were never even consulted on the construction of this barbed wire. That they felt that they were sort of shut out of the process. In their account, when they spoke to CBP officers about the lack of crime, the CBP officers said back, once again, this is what they said, that they were worried about criminal aliens coming into the city. So obviously that's the recollection of the city officials. But at least it shows that there doesn't seem to be as much coordination as there should be. And I think that that's going to, unless that gets rebuilt, there's going to be a lot of alienation. That the policies that the administration is pursuing is going to alienate a lot of local partners, which could be really problematic.
Dave, I want to bring you in on something I mentioned at the top here, which is the decisions by governors in California and New Mexico to withdraw National Guard troops. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. And just a reminder for listeners, too, that the use of National Guard troops is something that has been done in the past. Both Presidents George W. Bush and President Obama used National Guard forces for border security reasons during their administrations. Within the last year or so, the Trump administration used National Guard forces, and some of those forces are the ones that you talk about that governors are now withdrawing from the border mission. But importantly, President Trump decided to use active duty military forces for the border mission, which is something that had not been done before. A key point there is that under U.S. law, active duty military forces are prohibited from engaging in domestic law enforcement activities. So a lot of questions arise about how are active duty military forces being involved in the border security mission, which is a domestic law enforcement mission. They'll talk about support type roles. But the question again is, using active duty military forces is much different than the use of National Guard forces. Two other points in the administration's fact sheet that they put out on border security after the emergency declaration. It notes that governors in the past have declared their own states of emergency along the border, noting the Arizona Governor Napolitano back in 2005, and also Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico in 2005. Key point, though, in 2005, apprehensions at the southwest border numbered nearly 1.2 million people. So I'm sure that the governors of Arizona and New Mexico saw these very differently than those governors do today. As a point of comparison, just last year, fiscal year 18, the number of apprehensions at the southwest border was just under 400,000. So again, less than half of what we saw in 2005. So the fact that governors declared states of emergency, much different circumstances. And then, as I mentioned, Presidents Bush and Obama did deploy the National Guard, but they didn't deploy active duty forces. So that's a key difference as well.
The other thing I would just say, that going back to where we started, it's the deployment of the active duty forces that is key to the National Emergency Declaration, because the extent to which the reallocation of money is in support of the role of the active duty military. But the active duty military is in support of civilian law enforcement. So they're not on the front lines. So I imagine in the litigation, going back to this, that will be a key question of how is this supporting the active duty military at the border when the active duty military are not actively enforcing the border, so to speak.
Right. And again, this idea that these funds are going to be used for border barriers. How do you tie the construction of border barriers to be directly in support of a U.S. military force that can't conduct domestic law enforcement?
All right, I think that's as good a place as any to leave it for this episode. I want to thank you all for a good conversation, and thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Cris, Ramón, and myself, and produced by Ashley Swearingen. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.